January 24th, 1989 morning. A large crowd gathered in front of the Florida State Prison, cheering with joy. Fireworks lit up the sky, and expressions of relief could be seen on people's faces. Inside, Theodore Robert Ted Bundy, one of America's most notorious serial killers, was about to take his last breath on the electric chair. The execution took place at 7 a.m. When the prison spokesman announced that Bundy was officially dead, the crowd cheered with excitement. As a white hearse carried the last remnants of a living nightmare out of the prison gates and toward the crematorium, people celebrated as if a victory had been won. So what was the dark story that led a handsome and intelligent law student to become such a monster? In this video, we take a cold-blooded look at Ted Bundy's double life, the horrific crimes he committed, and the terrifying legacy he left behind. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Vermont, the child of an extramarital affair. His mother, Louise Cowell, took him to Philadelphia to live with his grandparents immediately after his birth due to family pressure. As little Ted grew up, his biological mother was introduced to him for years as his sister. His grandparents acted as his parents. When he was 4 years old, his mother Louise left her family, took Ted with her, and moved to Tacoma, Washington. Louise married a sailor named Johnny Culpeper Bundy, and Ted took his stepfather's surname. Bundy was now growing up with his new family and 4 step-siblings. As a child, Ted was introverted, shy, and sensitive. At school, he was often teased by his peers and subjected to bullying. Nevertheless, he consistently excelled in his studies, showing particular interest in subjects like law and politics. Although his stepfather, Johnny Bundy, tried to get closer to him by taking him camping and fishing, Ted remained distant. During his teenage years, his self-confidence was still low, and he struggled to form relationships with girls. He spent most of his free time skiing alone or listening to talk shows on the radio, learning to live in his own world, away from people. During these years, he began committing petty thefts. For example, he would steal his friends' ski equipment and use it as if it were his own. Not getting caught while committing petty crimes excited him and made him feel powerful. This was the first sign of a habit that would later evolve into much darker actions. After graduating from high school in 1965, Ted enrolled at Puget Sound University at his family's suggestion. However, he was uncomfortable in crowded environments and soon transferred to the University of Washington. Here, he tried to appear different by studying Chinese. In fact, in his own words, he wanted to learn Chinese to gain status. At university, he finally experienced a turning point in his social life. In 1967, he had his first serious relationship with a smart and wealthy young woman known by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks. Stephanie was Ted's first love and his first sexual experience. This relationship had instilled confidence in Ted. However, this happiness did not last long. In 1968, Stephanie graduated and returned to California, ending the relationship on the grounds that Ted had no plans for the future. Ted Bundy was devastated by this breakup. He lost focus on his studies. He was forced to drop out of college and entered a period of depression. He continued to obsessively write letters to his ex-girlfriend, but received no response. Being abandoned by a woman he valued for the first time left Ted with a deep sense of anger and humiliation. The seeds of the terrible events that would unfold in the future may have been sown during this period. In the summer of 1969, Ted, experiencing an identity crisis, went to Philadelphia to live with his grandfather and grandmother, whom he had believed to be his parents for years. There, with a birth certificate he found by chance, he discovered the most shocking truth of his life. Louise, whom he called his sister, was actually his biological mother, and his father's house was empty. In other words, his father's identity was unknown. This shocking discovery shook Ted even more deeply. He was furious that his mother had lied to him his whole life. Although he did not abandon Louise and return to Seattle to be with her, Ted's inner world was now in turmoil. This devastation regarding his past and identity severely damaged his trust in people. During this period, he made a criminal friend and turned even more to theft. He could easily steal whatever he wanted from shops or homes and get away with it. While those around him were deceived by his appearance and polite demeanor, Ted had become skilled at theft and had begun to take pleasure in it. He felt no remorse or guilt. This growing tendency toward crime fueled the dark side of Bundy's double life. In the early 1970s, Ted decided to get his life back on track. He returned to Seattle and enrolled in the psychology department at the University of Washington, where he began to excel in his studies. His professors described him as an intelligent and brilliant student. During these years, he even volunteered at the Seattle Crisis Center, working on the suicide hotline. Ironically, he was helping to save the lives of others. One of his supervisors at the time was Anne Rule, who would later become a famous author. In her book, The Stranger Beside Me, Anne Rule describes Ted Bundy as a handsome, polite, intelligent young man. She emphasized that no one would suspect him. Indeed, Ted managed to project a respectable image in society. By the time he received his psychology degree in 1973, his confidence had returned, and he had even developed his social skills. He was also actively involved in politics. He volunteered in Washington Governor Daniel Emelson's re-election campaign and even impressed at local Republican Party events. He became a popular employee at the party, known for his attention to his appearance, his wit, and his friendliness. Meanwhile, in his private life, he began a relationship with a woman named Liz Kendall, who was divorced from her husband and went by the alias Elizabeth Klopfer. Although his relationship with Liz had reached a serious stage, Bundy was leading a double life during this period. While making marriage plans with Liz on one hand, he was cheating on her on the other, mysteriously disappearing at night. Liz had begun to notice some strange behavior in Bundy. Stolen items appeared in the house, and he went on unexplained nighttime excursions, but she kept quiet because of her love for him. In 1973, Ted made another attempt to realize his dream of attending law school. Although he failed on his first attempts, with the help of influential acquaintances in political circles, he was eventually accepted to the University of Utah College of Law. Ready to make a fresh start, he left Washington in the fall of 1974 and prepared to move to Utah. On the surface, he was a promising young man with his life on track. He was well-educated, ambitious, and generous, yet the dark side within Ted Bundy had already awakened and was waiting for its chance. Soon, a murderer who would spread terror across America was about to be born. By 1974, young college women in Washington state in the northwestern United States began mysteriously disappearing. On January 4th of that year, roommates of 18-year-old Johnny Lenz, who lived in Seattle, found Johnny unconscious in her bed, horribly injured. The young woman had suffered severe blows to the head and was unconscious. Even more horrifying was the fact that a severed metal rod had been savagely thrust into her genitals. Johnny Lenz miraculously survived. However, this attack, which left him in a coma for years and caused permanent brain damage, was the first act of an assailant who was still unknown in the area. The assailant's identity remained hidden because Johnny survived, and the police, believing this to be an isolated act of brutality, failed to make any comprehensive connections. Just 1 month later, on the night of October 31st, 1974, University of Washington student Linda Ann Healy vanished from her bedroom. The next morning, bloodstains were found in her room, but there was no sign of Linda. While her family and friends searched frantically for the young woman, similar nightmares continued to unfold over the next few weeks. In February and March, several more young women disappeared from the Seattle area. In March, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson left her dorm for a concert one night and never returned. In April, Evergreen State College student Susan Rancourt vanished while returning from an evening event on campus. In May, a student named Roberta Parks disappeared from her campus in Oregon. Then in June 1974, 2 more disappearances occurred in quick succession. A young woman named Brenda Ball was last seen leaving a bar. A university student named Jorgen Hawkins disappeared into the night while walking from the fraternity house to her dorm. The only similarity between these unrelated disappearances was that they involved attractive young female university students. While the public anxiously followed this mystery, the police stated they had almost no concrete leads. Only a few witnesses had mentioned seeing a young, handsome man with his arm in a sling near some of the victims. This detail was not given much importance at the time. However, the killer had already begun playing his game to lure his victims. July 14, 1974, marked one of the first turning points in the Ted Bundy case. It was a sunny Sunday at the popular Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle. Hundreds of families and young people were picnicking and sunbathing by the lake. That evening, two young women from the park, 23-year-old Janice Ott and 19-year-old Denise Naslund, disappeared. Surprisingly, there were many witnesses this time. Many people reported seeing a handsome man with his arm in a sling approaching different young women, introducing himself as Ted and asking for help loading his boat into his car. Janice Ott was last seen leaving the crowd with this seemingly polite man to help him. Hours later, Denise Naslund similarly spoke with the same man and left with him. Nothing more was heard from the two young women. Police obtained concrete information for the first time after this brazen abduction. The suspect's name was probably Teldy. His arm was bandaged. He was driving a beige Volkswagen Beetle. A composite sketch was drawn with the help of witnesses at the park and released to the media. A wave of panic began to sweep through Seattle and its surrounding areas. It was now almost certain that a serial killer was on the loose. Bundy's girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, also became suspicious after seeing the composite sketch and descriptions published on television and in newspapers. The inexplicable disappearance of her boyfriend, his ownership of a similar Volkswagen vehicle, and his name being Ted terrified her. In August 1974, Elizabeth anonymously called the Seattle police to report that her boyfriend might be connected to the recent murders of women. The police noted the name Liz gave them. However, because hundreds of similar calls came into the tip line at that time, the name Ted Bundy was lost among the crowded lists. No one wanted to believe that this well-dressed, helpful-looking young man could be Ted, who was terrorizing Washington state. By the end of summer 1974, Washington police finally obtained the first physical evidence related to the missing women. In September 1974, a hunter discovered human remains buried in the ground in a wooded area a few kilometers from Lake Sammamish. Searches revealed bones and skulls belonging to two different young women. Despite the scarcity of remains, forensic experts identified them as Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. Additional remains, possibly belonging to other women missing in Washington, were found in different areas over the following months. The horrific truth was now clear. A serial killer had been active in the Seattle area, murdering at least several victims and burying them in remote locations. The media quickly made headlines out of the story. A wave of panic spread among the public. Young women in particular were on edge. They were warned not to walk alone at night and not to help strangers. Meanwhile, while the Seattle investigation team was pursuing their suspect named Ted Bundy had already set his sights on new prey. In the fall of 1974, Ted Bundy left Washington and enrolled in the law program at the University of Utah. Settling into a quiet apartment in Salt Lake City, Bundy appeared to be starting a new life. However, it wasn't long before young women began disappearing and being murdered in Utah as well. In October 1974, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox vanished in Salt Lake City's Bandlios. Bundy would confess to this murder years later. On October 18th, 17-year-old Melissa Smith, the daughter of the police chief of Midvale, did not return home after meeting with friends. 9 days later, her body was found in a mountainous area. The young girl had been raped and murdered. Once again, at the end of October, on Halloween night, 17-year-old Laura Aim disappeared after leaving a party. Her body was discovered a month later on the banks of a river. The cause of death was trauma from severe blows to the skull. In these cases in Utah, the victims were also young, long-haired, beautiful girls. In fact, most were children under the age of 18. The police began to suspect that the killer might be the same person. However, there was no concrete evidence, until one victim narrowly escaped death. On the evening of November 8, 1974, an 18-year-old girl named Carol Duranch encountered a man approaching her in the parking lot of a shopping center in Murray, Utah. This well-groomed young man, who identified himself as a police officer, told Carol that he had seen someone trying to break into her car and had stopped them, and offered to go with her to check. The man showed Carol a badge resembling a police ID to gain her trust. Carol went with him, believing he was really a civilian security guard or police officer. After talking next to the car in the parking lot, the supposed police officer got Carol into his Volkswagen under the pretext of taking her to the police station. Shortly after the car started moving, he suddenly pulled over in a secluded spot. The moment Carol sensed something was wrong, the man tried to handcuff her. When Carol panicked and resisted, the fake cop pulled out a gun and threatened her. The young girl fought back desperately. She sprayed pepper spray in the attacker's face and kicked him in the groin, throwing herself out of the car. Carol ran onto the road, and luckily, a couple passing by picked her up in their car. Screaming hysterically that a man had tried to kill her, she persuaded them to take her to the police. This was Ted Bundy's first known failed attack, and it would be his biggest mistake. Thanks to Carol Durant, the police finally had concrete leads. The young girl gave a detailed description of the attacker. He was approximately 5'11", could be considered handsome, had brown hair, and spoke politely. His vehicle was a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. There were also traces of the attacker's blood type on Carol's coat. His blood type was identified as type O positive. Meanwhile, on the same night, 17-year-old Debbie Kent disappeared from the school parking lot after leaving a high school theater performance in the town of Bountiful, Utah. A handcuff key was found at the scene, and it was determined that this key could open the handcuffs left on Carol. It didn't take long to establish a connection between the two incidents. Police announced that the person who attacked Durant had probably also kidnapped Debbie Kent and could be a serial killer roaming the area. By the time 1975 rolled around, the murder investigations in Washington and Utah had begun to intersect. Detectives in Washington had started to suspect a young man named Ted Bundy, who had moved from Seattle to Utah to study law. Thanks in particular to reports from his ex-girlfriend, Elizabeth Clofer, Bundy's description, car, and behavior matched that of the wanted killer. However, the police had no evidence directly linking him to the crimes, so they simply kept him under surveillance. Meanwhile, Ted Bundy continued killing in Utah and neighboring states. In January 1975, nurse Karen Campbell disappeared from the hallway of her hotel in Snow, a town near Aspen, Colorado. Her body was found a month later under the snow. In March 1975, Julie Denise Oliverson disappeared, followed by 12-year-old Lynette Culver in May. These would also be added to Bundy's confession list years later. In June 1975, 15-year-old Susan Curtis disappeared from her school campus in Utah. At least 5 states were now reeling from similar unsolved murders of women. Although authorities suspected the existence of an interstate serial killer, there was still no coordinated investigation. On August 16, 1975, Ted Bundy's killing spree came to an unexpected halt. Police officer Bob Hayward, patrolling a suburb near Salt Lake City, Utah, attempted to stop a Volkswagen driving with its headlights off late at night. The driver panicked and attempted to flee when he noticed the police car. After a brief chase, the police managed to stop the Volkswagen. The person behind the wheel was Ted Bundy. Bundy was arrested for acting suspiciously, and his car was searched. The search revealed an arsenal of items that could be considered murder weapons. A ski mask with holes cut in it, a mask made from a woman's stocking, plastic handcuffs, gloves, a crowbar-type iron rod, a bag of nails, tape, and a knife were seized. These items matched those used by the person who attacked Carol Durant. In addition, hair strands collected from the vehicle were reported by the FBI to be microscopically similar to the hair of Melissa Smith and Karen Campbell, who had been killed earlier. Bundy's car was like a mobile crime scene, providing the police with their first concrete links. When Ted Bundy was arrested and questioned, he remained calm and claimed that he had these tools with him for theft purposes. However, it was now possible to arrange a face-to-face identification for Carol Durant to identify her attacker. On October 2, 1975, Carol Durant and witnesses, including a friend of Debbie Kent, positively identified Bundy in a lineup of 7 men. When Carol tearfully pointed to the police officer who had attacked her, identifying him as Bundy, Ted Bundy's mask was officially dropped for the first time. Bundy still claimed he was innocent, but Utah prosecutors were determined to try him for attempting to kidnap Carol Duranch. On February 23, 1976, Ted Bundy stood trial for the crime of attempting to kidnap Carol Duranch. Bundy stood in the courtroom with an extremely confident demeanor, as if he were someone who had been wrongfully tried. During the trial, when Carol recounted the horror she had experienced and again identified Bundy as her attacker in court, everyone in the room turned their eyes to the defendant. Bundy stated in his testimony that he was not there that day and did not know Carol. However, he could not provide a credible excuse or evidence. After several days of trial, the court found Bundy guilty of kidnapping. On June 30, 1976, the judge sentenced Ted Bundy to between 1 and 15 years in prison. Bundy was sent to the Utah State Prison, and it seemed that justice had been served. But this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. While Ted Bundy was serving his sentence in Utah, authorities in other states were trying to prove he had committed murders there. Colorado police gathered evidence related to the Karen Campbell murder and charged Bundy with murder in 1976. The blow marks on Karen Campbell's skull matched the shape of a crowbar found in Bundy's car. Furthermore, hair samples taken from Bundy's car matched those of both Campbell and Melissa Smith. In April 1977, Ted Bundy was extradited to Colorado and transferred to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs. Under the pretext of preparing for his upcoming trial, he requested permission to leave the jail and work at the court library in Aspen. Finding his lawyer inadequate, he dismissed him and decided to act as his own lawyer, aided by his own legal knowledge. Since he was a defendant's lawyer, the court approved Bundy's occasional visits to the library under supervision. It was then that Ted Bundy put his ingenious escape plan into action. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was present at the Aspen Courthouse Library, ostensibly to prepare for the trial. Bundy managed to slip away from the deputy's sight for a short time and did not miss his chance. He suddenly threw himself out of a second-floor window that had been left open. Despite spraining his ankle after jumping from a height of about 10 meters, he quickly recovered and began staggering toward the forest. Since he was not wearing handcuffs or shackles, he disappeared into the town of Aspen unnoticed among the surrounding civilians. As soon as news of his escape spread, the police launched a large-scale manhunt. Bloodhounds and a 150-person team combed the wooded areas, but Bundy was a master at covering his tracks. He hid in mountain cabins for days, stealing supplies. He managed to survive by sleeping in abandoned cabins. A few days later, he found an unlocked car near Aspen and managed to steal it. However, on the 6th day of his escape, late at night, a police car patrolling the road spotted the stolen car by chance. After a brief chase, Bundy was recaptured. This first escape lasted only 6 days. The authorities had learned their lesson. From then on, even while Bundy was preparing for trial, he would be kept handcuffed and shackled. But Ted Bundy was not one to be chained down. He had no intention of giving up. 7 months after his first escape attempt, Bundy once again took action to regain his freedom. He secretly cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell at Garfield County Jail. He had lost weight for days to make his body small enough to fit through the narrow opening. On the night of December 30th, 1977, while other inmates were spending time in their cells as the new year approached, Ted climbed through the hole in the ceiling that opened to the next floor. Taking advantage of the old structure of the facility, he crawled along the ceiling and eventually reached the ceiling of the guards' adjacent quarters. Realizing the quarters were empty at the time, he slipped down through the opening in the ceiling. Dressed in civilian clothes, he walked out the front door as if nothing had happened. His escape was not discovered until 17 hours later, the following day at noon. During this time, Bundy had already left the state. He had even boarded a train to Chicago. From there, he headed south. His goal was to reach a place where he could blend in among people who didn't know him. By January 1978, when he arrived in Tallahassee, a sunny university town in Florida, his plan seemed to be working. Under his new false identity, Chris Hagen, he began living quietly in an apartment. He acquired most of his household goods and food through theft or stolen credit cards, seemingly living a low-profile life without attracting attention. Still, the hunter within Bundy could not remain inactive for long. His desire for violence had only intensified during his time in prison in Utah. Unfortunately, Florida would be Ted Bundy's final and bloodiest hunting ground. On the night of January 14, 1978, into January 15th, a brutal attack took place at the Omega sorority house on the Florida State University campus. Many students who had spent Saturday night at parties had not yet returned to the dorm. At around 3 a.m., a student named Nita Neary was dropped off at her dorm by her boyfriend after a party. When Nita noticed the door was ajar and went inside, she heard footsteps from the upper floor. Seconds later, she saw a dark figure rushing down the stairs, a man wearing a blue beanie. He was carrying a thick piece of wood with a cloth tied to the end and was running out the front door. While Nita was trying to figure out what was happening, the sounds from upstairs had stopped. Thinking a burglar had entered, she immediately ran up the stairs to wake her roommates. In the hallway, she found her roommate Karan staggering. The young girl's head was completely covered in blood. Her face was unrecognizable. Nita and the others, panicked, woke up the dorm supervisor. Meanwhile, another room was checked. A student named Kate was found in her bed with severe injuries and her head covered in blood, and attempts were made to revive her. Nita and her roommates immediately called the police. When the officers arrived at the dormitory building, they were met with a horrific scene. Two young women, 20-year-old Lisa Levy and 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, had been brutally murdered in their rooms, in their beds. The investigation revealed that Lisa Levy had been repeatedly struck on the head with a piece of wood while she slept, strangled, and sexually assaulted. The killer had left perverse marks on Lisa's body. There were distinct bite marks on her hip and part of her chest. A can of hairspray was also found on the bed. It was understood that the attacker had sexually assaulted the girl's body. Margaret Bowman's body also had similar injuries. Her skull was fractured, and she had suffered blows severe enough to expose brain tissue. She had been strangled with a sock wrapped around her neck. It was understood that the poor girls had been caught off guard in their sleep and had died without being able to defend themselves. Karen Chandler and Katie Kleinera, who were found seriously injured in the same dormitory, were immediately taken to the hospital. Both had miraculously survived despite suffering head injuries. However, they remembered nothing about the attack. This was because they too had been struck while asleep. The only person who clearly saw the killer's face was Nita Neary. She had only seen the man's profile and the moment he fled. News of the Chi Omega massacre sent shockwaves across the country. No one wanted to believe that such a brutal attack could occur in a sorority house, in the midst of a supposedly safe campus life. Evidence at the scene was limited. As the attacker fled in a hurry, he dropped a mask which was almost identical to the mask found in Bundy's car in Utah in 1975. Additionally, the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body would later become critical evidence in the case. But that night, the attacker didn't stop there. Just a few blocks away from the Chi Omega house, another young woman was attacked that night. 21-year-old dancer Shirley Thomas was seriously injured by blows to the head while sleeping in her apartment. When neighbors called the police after hearing noises from the adjacent apartment, officers arrived quickly since they were already nearby due to the Chi Omega attack. Shirley was found unconscious and covered in blood in her bedroom. She was partially clothed and suffering from a head injury, but she was alive. A sock mask was also found in her room. Putting all this evidence together, the Tallahassee police realized that a vicious criminal had been on the loose at two separate crime scenes that same night. However, the attacker's identity was still unknown. The name Ted Bundy meant nothing to the Florida police at that moment. Just a few weeks after the Chi Omega massacre, on the morning of February 9, 1978, tragic news came from a middle school in Lake City, Florida. Kimberly Like, a 12-year-old student, had disappeared from the school grounds. Her friends reported seeing her last talking to a middle-aged man who approached her. Some said the man put Kimberly into a white minivan. The little girl's family was devastated. the police launched an extensive search. Unfortunately, the 2-month search ended tragically in April 1978. Kimberly's decomposed body was found in a wooded area in Suwannee County. The body had decomposed so badly that forensic science could not obtain much evidence. However, this incident took the Bundy attacks, which had already caused an uproar in Florida, to an even more horrific level, because the victim was a child for the first time. Around the time little Kimberly disappeared in Lake City, a detective's children in nearby Jacksonville had also narrowly escaped a similar danger. Jacksonville Police Deputy Chief James Permanter's daughter was molested by a man who approached her in a white minivan near her school. The man, who identified himself as a firefighter, asked the girl strange questions. However, just then, the girl's brother arrived and rescued her by taking her away in his car. Suspicious, the brother noted the minivan's license plate and relayed it to his father. Detective Permanter determined that the license plate was stolen and that the minivan had also been stolen. Searching police mugshots based on his sister's description, the brother identified the man who had approached them. It was none other than Ted Bundy, the notorious fugitive on the FBI's most wanted list. Thus, the Florida police painfully learned that the person behind the brutal attacks in Tallahassee and Lake City was Ted Bundy, who had escaped from Colorado in 1977. This dangerous fugitive, wanted everywhere, was now also a suspect in a child murder in Florida. When Ted Bundy realized he was cornered in Florida, he began making new escape plans. He stole a camper in St. Petersburg. He then attempted to flee the state in a car he stole in Tallahassee. On the night of February 15, 1978, police officer David Lee, on patrol in Pensacola, noticed an unfamiliar orange Volkswagen. When he ran the license plate, he learned the car was stolen. Officer Lee immediately attempted to stop the vehicle. Bundy tried to escape again, but was quickly forced to pull over. When the police officer told Bundy to get out of the car and lie down on the ground, Bundy pretended to comply, but then attacked the officer. A scuffle ensued. Bundy tried to grab the officer's gun. However, the officer overpowered him, subdued him, and handcuffed him. Ted Bundy, who had committed countless murders in 4 states, escaped from prison twice, and had been terrorizing Florida in recent months, was finally caught. When Ted Bundy was taken to the police station, he tried to conceal his true identity. He gave a false name. However, fingerprint identification and FBI records revealed him to be the notorious fugitive. It is rumored that one of the first things he said when arrested was, "I wish you had shot me." Perhaps realizing he had been caught, he was overcome with fear of death, thinking that execution was inevitable. When Bundy was searched, clues to his identity and stolen credit cards were found. This arrest in Pensacola marked the end of Ted Bundy's criminal career. It was time to face justice. Shortly after his arrest in Florida, Ted Bundy was formally charged with the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, and then with the murders of 2 students at the Chi Omega sorority house. While prosecutors prepared their indictments seeking the death penalty, Bundy claimed he was innocent. Ted Bundy's first trial began on June 25, 1979 in Miami. This trial would become one of the most sensational criminal cases in American history. Television cameras were present in the courtroom. The national press was broadcasting every moment live. The entire country began watching the trial of this killer, nicknamed the Monster, on their screens. Ted Bundy, brought into the courtroom, seemed to thrive on this attention. He had decided to act as his own lawyer during the trial. He conducted most of his own defense and took the stand during cross-examinations. Bundy was overly confident in his legal knowledge and persuasive abilities. He tried to influence the jury by claiming he was innocent and that the media had demonized him. However, in the face of the evidence and witnesses, his devilish charm would not work this time. 2 critical testimonies took place, marking the turning point of the trial. First, Nita Neary, an eyewitness from the Chi Omega sorority house, stated without hesitation that the man who ran down the stairs that night was Ted Bundy, the man in the lounge. Although Bundy tried to appear unfazed by this diagnosis, it had a significant impact on the jury. The second major piece of evidence was the forensic dental analysis. Photographs of bite marks taken from Liza Levy's hip and chest were shown to the jury in court. Forensic dentist Dr. Richard took the stand and scientifically explained that Bundy's dental structure matched these marks perfectly. The unique crookedness and protrusions of Bundy's teeth matched the wound marks on Lisa's body exactly. This was the strongest evidence the prosecution had, and it demolished the defense's strategy of denial. Ted Bundy tried to maintain a calm demeanor throughout the trial, but it was clear he was cornered. After a trial lasting approximately 6 weeks, the jury convened on July 23, 1979, to announce its verdict. Even while awaiting the outcome in his cell, Ted Bundy remained confident. However, even though he wore an expressionless face when the verdict was announced, he knew his end had come. The jury had unanimously found him guilty on each of the 2 first-degree murder charges and 3 separate assault charges. Ted Bundy had been found guilty of the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. According to Florida law, a separate hearing would be held to determine his sentence. A week later, at the sentencing hearing on July 30, 1979, Bundy's mother, Louise, tearfully begged the jury not to execute her son. In his final words, Ted claimed he was innocent and had not received a fair trial because of the media, saying his conscience was clear. He showed no remorse, stating, "It would be ridiculous to ask for mercy for something I didn't do." Presiding Judge Edward Crote addressed Bundy at the moment of the verdict with these historic words. Referring to Bundy's intelligence and legal skills, he said, "It is unfortunate that such a brilliant young talent has gone astray. I wish life had turned out differently. You could have been a good lawyer," he said. Then he announced the verdict. "But this court sentences you to death twice." The electric chair awaited Bundy in Florida. Immediately after the Chi Omega case, Ted Bundy was brought before the court in Orlando in January 1980 for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. This time, the strategy changed. Bundy did not defend himself. 2 experienced lawyers took his place. His lawyers decided to make a desperate move and plead insanity. They argued that their client may have committed the murders, but did so while psychotic. However, this risky defense was not convincing. Throughout the trial, Bundy's demeanor suggested that he was of sound mind. Sitting at the defense table, he often became irritated and reacted angrily to witness testimony. At one point, he was warned by the judge for shouting at a witness. At this moment, the jury witnessed Bundy's mask slipping and his aggressive personality showing. Due to his conviction in the Chi Omega case, the outcome of this trial was already widely anticipated. The prosecution brought a total of 65 witnesses who saw Bundy on the day Kimberly Lee was abducted. A school friend said the person who put Kimberly in the white van looked very much like Bundy. One of the strongest pieces of evidence was the match between fibers from Bundy's clothes, examined after his arrest, and fibers from Kimberly's clothes. Additionally, fibers from the clothes Bundy wore that day were also found inside the stolen minivan. This confirmed that the little girl had been in that vehicle. The forensic fiber analysis expert clearly stated that all the findings pointed to Bundy. Perhaps the strangest moment of the trial was Bundy's marriage proposal during a court hearing. Carol Ann Boone, whom Bundy knew from his days in Washington and who believed in his innocence, was a defense witness in the case. At one point during the hearing, Bundy proposed to Carol, and according to Florida law, they were married before the judge with a marriage declaration made in court. This unexpected move caused astonishment in the courtroom. The press ran headlines about the serial killer getting married in the courtroom. Boone was Bundy's biggest supporter in prison and would later give birth to his child. However, even this spectacle failed to sway the jury. In February 1980, the jury found Ted Bundy guilty of kidnapping and murdering Kimberly Lee. The judge once again sentenced Bundy to death. Thus, Ted Bundy was sentenced to death 3 times in total. As Ted Bundy was led out of the courtroom, he still flashed a flirtatious smile at the cameras, insisting he would maintain his claim of innocence. But ahead of him lay a life spent behind bars and a path leading to death row. The late 1970s was a period when American society confronted the concept of the serial killer. The Ted Bundy trial was one of the most sensational examples of this confrontation. The press competed with each other to put Bundy on the front pages. Because of his handsome face and background as a law student, The media presented him as a deadly, attractive serial killer. The televised broadcasts of these trials glued millions to their screens. The American public was watching the trial of a serial killer live for the first time, and this brought interest in this type of true crime to a boiling point. The courtroom was like a show center. Those wishing to attend the hearings as spectators formed a queue. It was observed that Bundy had developed a peculiar fan base, particularly among young women. The press interviewed women sitting in the audience during the hearings who had parted their hair down the middle like Bundy, believing them to be his type. Psychologists began to explain that some women were attracted to notorious killers due to an obsessive fan syndrome. Bundy welcomed this attention. He would occasionally smile at the cameras. He behaved as if he were a movie star rather than a prisoner. His legal exchanges with the prosecutors who questioned him created the feeling of watching a legal drama on TV. From 1980 to 1989, Ted Bundy awaited execution at the Florida Rayford prison. During this time, his appeal lawyers repeatedly tried to delay the sentence. The initial execution date set for March 4, 1986, was postponed at the last minute due to legal maneuvers. Bundy's new lawyer, Paul Nelson, prolonged the process with appeals. However, the outcome remained unchanged. In 1988, all appeals were rejected. By January 1989, when the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the final appeal, time was running out for Bundy. As the execution date approached, Ted Bundy confessed to many crimes he had denied until then. Perhaps he hoped that by providing information to the authorities, he could delay his execution a little longer. In his final days on death row, he met with FBI agents and detectives from different states and described approximately 30 murders in detail. He even had a private meeting with Washington detective Robert Bob Keppel, who had been pursuing him for years, and described the locations of all the missing bodies he knew about. Keppel and the others were horrified by Bundy's words. Bundy calmly recounted how he had cut off the heads of some of his victims and kept them as souvenirs, and how he had repeatedly had sex with the corpses after they died. According to Bundy's confessions, there were more than 30 murders he admitted to between 1973 and 1978. However, he implied that the actual number was likely over 100. Only Ted Bundy knew how many lives were lost, and he would take that secret to his grave. In a final media interview, he surprisingly claimed that his exposure to pornography as a child drove him to commit crimes, attempting to blame external factors. Many experts considered this a final manipulative move. And finally, the day of his execution arrived. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was strapped to the electric chair in the execution chamber. His last words were simply greetings to his family and friends. At 5:16 p.m., the electric current was turned on. Bundy's life ended within minutes. Outside, a crowd of about 500 people cheered as if it were a carnival when the prison sirens sounded and officials announced Bundy's death. Some wore t-shirts with drawings of electric chairs, others set off fireworks. This unusual celebration was indicative of how demonized Ted Bundy had become in the public eye. A mother gave an interview saying, "Now our children can sleep peacefully." As the vehicle carrying Bundy's body left the prison gates, people cheered and whistled. Ted Bundy was examined repeatedly by psychiatrists and crime experts. The picture that emerged was a combination of narcissistic personality disorder, psychopathy, and advanced manipulation skills. Bundy was arrogant, seeing himself as superior to everyone else. His desire to enter politics and his efforts to get into law school were all fundamentally related to his desire to prove himself and be admired. A psychological evaluation conducted while he was in prison stated that he was of sound mind and was not defined as psychotic, neurotic, or sexually deviant. However, his excessive dependence on women and fear of humiliation had been identified. It was thought that he developed a wounded ego, especially when confronted by women who were authority figures or who rejected him. The humiliation he experienced when his first love, Stephanie, left him may have shaped the type of victim he would target in the future. One of Bundy's most prominent traits was his powerful ability to manipulate. He could skillfully manipulate people's emotions and perceptions. He constantly acted and assumed different identities to lure his victims into his trap. Sometimes he played the role of a polite college student, sometimes an injured accident victim, and sometimes a police officer. Hanging one arm in a sling and using amateur acting skills to lure kind-hearted women into his trap was an example of his diabolical intelligence. He was also successful in manipulating those close to him. Elizabeth Clover, who had been with him for a long time, could not accept that Bundy could be guilty despite his oddities. Bundy's mask of love kept Lizzie away from the truth. While in prison, he had convinced Carol Ann Boone, who had fallen in love with him, that he was innocent and had even managed to have a child with her. He was a master at manipulating people and exploiting them. Underneath this was a personality completely devoid of empathy, indifferent to the feelings of his victims. Bundy showed no remorse and felt no pangs of conscience. Even after his arrest, he showed no sign of apology or compassion to the victims' families. Another concept used to understand Ted Bundy's character is dual personality. This, of course, was not a true clinical multiple personality disorder. Bundy's situation was more like a psychopath wearing a mask of innocence, living a double life. During the day, he played the role of a respectable student, a hardworking volunteer, and a loving boyfriend in society, but when night fell, the hunter within him emerged. He himself once likened this dark impulse within him to a being that took hold of me. It was as if there was a sleeping monster inside him that took control whenever it had the chance. This analogy may have been Bundy's attempt to evade responsibility. However, the unimaginable cruelty he inflicted on his victims' bodies was too ruthless to be the act of a normal person. Forensic psychology experts describe Bundy as a criminal who perfectly fits the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, while also exhibiting distinct narcissistic traits. For example, during the trial, his defense of himself simply because he enjoyed being on stage and his constant attempts to be the center of attention are typical narcissistic behaviors. He considered himself so intelligent and talented that his belief that he would never be caught despite committing dozens of murders was a result of this excessive self-confidence. His 2 successful prison escapes reinforced this belief. Even when caught, he did not hesitate to defy the police with a smirk, thinking nothing would happen to him. Ultimately, Ted Bundy presented a sympathetic, polite, educated image to the outside world, while internally, he was a person who lived with violent fantasies and derived pleasure from the suffering of others. To summarize his psychological profile, he was a ruthless predator who could use his diabolical intelligence and charm like a weapon. This profile was precisely what made him one of the most notorious serial killers of the 20th century. We've reached the end of this video. See you next time. Take care.